Nearly a century ago, Hilaire Belloc, a European intellectual and historian, made a remarkably prophetic observation concerning Islam. Millions of modern people of the white civilization, that is, the civilization of Europe and America, have forgotten all about Islam. They have never come in contact with it. They take for granted that it is decaying and that, anyway, it is just a foreign religion, that which will not concern them. It is, as a fact, the most formidable and persistent enemy which our civilization has had, and may at any moment become as large a menace in the future as it has been in the past. And that's from his book, The Great Heresies. Few heeded Belloc's scaremongering. Sound familiar? And as a result, Islam is now the scourge of Europe, especially in those two nations from which Belloc's own family hailed: France, paternal side, and England, maternal. Anyone who doubts his claim would do well to familiarize themselves with Islam's long record of violence vis-a-vis the West. And that's what I'm going to do here in this video. Give you a brief summary of how Islam has indeed been the, quote, most formidable and persistent enemy of the West. Actually, because I use this quote in my book, Sword and Scimitar, I'm also going to trace this long history of hostility around the most pivotal battles between Islam and Christendom, as I did in the book. Okay, according to Islamic history, in 628, the Arabian founder of Islam, Muhammad, called on the Eastern Roman Emperor, Heraclius, the symbolic head of Christendom at the time, to recant Christianity and embrace Islam. The emperor refused, jihad was declared, and the Arabs invaded Christian Syria, defeating the imperial army at the pivotal Battle of Yarmouk in 636. This Muslim triumph enabled the Arabs to swarm in all directions, so that less than a century later, they had conquered the greater, older, and richer part of Christendom, including the entire Middle East, Egypt, and all of North Africa. The Muslim drive into Eastern Europe was repeatedly frustrated by the walls of Constantinople, however. After the spectacularly failed siege of 717, many centuries would pass before any Muslim power thought to capture New Rome. The Arabs did manage to invade Western Europe and conquered Spain, but were stopped at the Battle of Tours in 732. For more than 2 centuries thereafter, Islamic forces continued to pummel Europe by land and sea. Untold thousands of Christians were enslaved and every Mediterranean island sacked in the ongoing Muslim quest for booty and slaves, as what was once called the Dark Ages descended on the continent. The vicissitudes of war ebbed and flowed, with the Eastern Roman Empire even making a major comeback against Islam in the 10th century, though the border largely remained the same. This changed when the Turks, under the leadership of the Seljuk tribe, became the new standard bearers of the jihad. They nearly annihilated eastern Anatolia, particularly Armenia and Georgia, in the 11th century, massacring, according to the sources, tens of thousands of Christians and enslaving even more, especially after the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. At that point, they overran Asia Minor, engaging in even more atrocities, including the systematic destruction of thousands of churches, again, according to the sources. By then, however, Western Europe's military might had so matured that when the Pope, Urban II, called on the Knights of Christendom to come to the aid of the Christian East, the First Crusade was born. Western Christians marched into the beast's lair, defeated their adversaries in several encounters, and managed to establish a firm presence in the Levant, including in Jerusalem, which they recaptured in 1099, only to lose it less than 100 years later after the fateful Battle of Hattin in 1187. And a little over a century after that, in 1291, the Crusaders were eliminated from the Middle East. But if it failed in the East, the Crusades succeeded in the West. A handful of years after the aforementioned Muslim invasion and conquest of Spain around 711, fugitive Christians holed in the northern mountains of Asturia began the Reconquista, the Reconquest. By 1085, it had proven effective enough to prompt 2 new Muslim invasions from Africa to counter it. Again, the ebb and flow of war dominated the landscape, but by 1212, at Las Navas de Tolosa, the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, Spain's indigenous Christians gave Islam its death stroke, so that by 1252, it was confined to tiny little Granada at the southernmost tip of the Iberian Peninsula. Around that time, a violent but relatively short-lived Mongolian storm overwhelmed much of the East. Both Christians, notably Russians and other Slavs, and especially Muslims, were pummeled. A new Turkish dynasty arose from the Seljuk ashes. The Ottomans, whose identity revolved around the concept of jihad more than any of their predecessors, which is saying something, renewed Islam's perennial war on Christendom. They managed to enter Eastern Europe, defeated a combined army of crusaders at Nicopolis in 1396, took much of the Balkans, and in 1453 crowned their achievement by fulfilling Muhammad's dream of conquering Constantinople, enslaving and raping thousands of its inhabitants in ways that ISIS tries to mimic. But mourning was soon tempered by joy. To the west, Spain finally conquered Granada in 1492, thereby snuffing out Islam as a political power altogether. To the east, the most overlooked chapter of Muslim-Christian conflict was also coming to an end. The Russians, who had lived under distinctly Islamic rule for nearly 2 centuries, finally cast off the so-called Tatar yoke in 1480. Even so, the Ottomans continued to be the scourge of Christendom. They made inroads into Europe, reaching but failing to capture Vienna in 1529, and sponsored the Sea-borne Jihad originating from North Africa. While the Muslims largely failed to capture new European lands, so-called Barbary pirates and Crimean slavers captured and sold many millions of Europeans. In 1683, more than 200,000 Ottoman Turks attempted to take Vienna again. Even though their failure marked the Ottoman Empire's slow decline, Muslim slavers of the so-called Barbary states of North Africa continued to wreak havoc all along the coasts of Europe, reaching even distant Iceland and hauling off its wretched people in chains to be sold to North Africa. Indeed, the United States of America's first war, which it fought before it could even elect its first president, was against these Islamic slavers. When Thomas Jefferson and John Adams asked Barbary's ambassador why his countrymen were enslaving and torturing American sailors, the ambassador, wrote Jefferson in a letter to Congress, quote, told us that it was founded on the laws of their prophet, that it was written in their Quran, that it was their right and duty to make war upon non-Muslims wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners. This, incidentally, was a paraphrase of Quran 9:5, also known in Islamic jurisprudence as the sword verse. Europe's final triumph over the Barbary states in the early 1800s ushered in the colonial era. By 1900, most of the Muslim world was under European control. By 1924, the more than 600-year-old Ottoman Caliphate was abolished, not by Europeans, but by Muslim Turks, as the latter sought to emulate the successful ways of the West. Islam was viewed as a spent force and virtually forgotten until recent times when it re-emerged again. Such has been the true and most general history between the Islamic and Western worlds. This map should give you an idea of how far-reaching and multi-tentacled this perennial jihad was. The darkest green shading represents Christian nations that were permanently conquered by Islam. The lighter green shading represents those Christian nations that were temporarily conquered by Islam, sometimes for centuries, as in Spain, Russia, and the Balkans. The green stripes represent areas that were raided, often repeatedly. They were the no-man zone, oftentimes, though not necessarily annexed by Islam. The crossed swords mark the sites of the 8 most landmark battles between Islam and the West that I just mentioned. By the way, this is from my book, Sword and Scimitar, and it deals with those battles. Anyway, take a good look at it. Now, returning to Hilaire Belloc, one can also see how an accurate understanding of true history, as opposed to an indoctrination in mainstream pseudo-histories, leads to an accurate prognosis for the future. For Belloc was not only correct about the past, but the future as well. After he wrote that Islam is, quote, the most formidable and persistent enemy which our civilization has had, and may at any moment become as large a menace in the future as it has been in the past, he went on to write, quote, the whole spiritual strength of Islam is still present in the masses of Syria and Anatolia, meaning Turkey, of the East Asian mountains, of Arabia, Egypt, and North Africa. The final fruit of this tenacity, the second period of Islamic power, may be delayed, but I doubt whether it can be permanently postponed. Make no mistake about it, we are well into this second period of Islamic power. And contrary to what Belloc thought or hoped, not only has a suicidal West done absolutely nothing to delay, let alone permanently postpone, this resurgence, it has gone out of its way to help empower Islam in the West to its own detriment and demise.